Una Morera. This is a podcast about growing up as a Tibetan Buddhist in America. Although I have kept this a secret from even my closest friends, I was raised as a Tibetan Buddhist in Boulder, Colorado. My story begins in 1970 in New York City, when my mother heard a young Tibetan man give a lecture at St. Mark's Church in the Bowery. Let me go back for just a moment. When the Chinese invaded Tibet in 1959, it destroyed the country, but it also pushed it out of extreme isolation. By 1970, I'm not sure how many actual Tibetans had visited New York City or what people in America thought about Tibet. Tibetan Buddhism was deeply cloaked in mystery and exoticism, and whatever scholars truly knew about it was vague or inaccurate. In some ways, it's no different today than it was back in 1970. I can only imagine that it was still rare to meet someone from that part of the world.
Welcome to Shangri. You see, we are sheltered by mountains on every side. A strange phenomenon for which we are very grateful.
This is a clip from the 1937 classic film Lost Horizons, nominated for a Best Picture Academy Award in 1938 and directed by Frank Capra, who also directed the classic film It's a Wonderful Life. In the Tibetan Buddhist community I was raised in, this was our film. The story is easy to follow. Set in 1935, fleeing a Chinese revolution, British Foreign Secretary Richard Conway and a small party find themselves on a hijacked plane which crashes into the snowy Himalayas. Rescued by a Buddhist monk, the survivors are brought to Shangri, a sheltered paradise situated in a beautiful valley. Conway is introduced to the founder of Shangri, Hai Lama, who tells him the plane crash was no accident. He's dying and wishes to appoint Conway to be his successor. But Conway is persuaded by the rest of his party to return to civilization. The moment he leaves Shangri, all his memories of it disappear. On a ship, the movie ends after Conway suddenly remembers everything and jumps into the sea to return to his beloved Shangri. When I was growing up, we believed we lived in Shangri, and without our vigilance to protect it, it was so fragile it would disappear. We thought if we left, or if we even tried to leave, we would be like Conway, faced with having it forever erased from our memories, or worse, never able to return. Only we didn't call it Shangri, we called it Shambhala. This is about growing up in Shambhala and, like Conway, eventually leaving it to return to civilization. But unlike Conway, never forgetting what happened and never jumping ship to return.
Oh, the vampire bat was a sight to see.
Back to St. Mark's Church in the early winter of late 1970. Anne was sitting in the audience that night. She was worldlier than most and had just spent years in the Peace Corps in Kenya, having taken a page from reading books by Pearl S. Buck. When she discovered she was pregnant, she left the father behind and returned home to give birth. Knowing how hard it would be to raise a mixed-race child in America, she signed adoption papers, but right after a man walked on the moon and her son was born, she changed her mind. She reasoned, if we were ready for the moon, we were ready for a white mother with a black child.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
So that winter, while Anne had been living in New York City with a tiny baby boy looking for work, she had been invited to listen to a young Tibetan man speak. Before the event, she convinced herself that it was going to be a plea for the Tibetan refugees, and at the last minute decided not to go. Except she had lost the phone number of the woman who had invited her and didn't want to stand her up. So she dashed off on a quick walk to St. Mark's Church from her nearby Alphabet City apartment, which she shared with 4 other single mothers. Sitting in the pews that night, as the young Tibetan man spoke, her heart began to pound when she quickly realized this was not a refugee fundraiser. This was a Dharma talk about the nature of her own mind. My mother was in the audience that night too. I was only a few months old at the time, and we had been living in a room in a loft carved out from behind a black plastic curtain. The loft was shared by a group of video artists calling themselves the Video Freaks. My mother was interested in things like spirituality and yoga, and when she was asked to videotape the lecture, she dropped whatever she was doing to make it work. She had always wanted to meet someone from Tibet. But as my mother was setting up the video equipment, she realized she was missing an adapter and didn't have time to run back to the loft in Soho to get it. There was nothing she could do about it. She told me, instead of videotaping, she sat down and listened to a lecture that would change her life. She said the young Tibetan man rang a bell that was so deep inside her, she didn't even know it was there until he had played it. Anne only remembers that she felt so emotionally raw and broken open that as she walked home, she promised herself if she saw an open manhole on the street, she would dive into it. None of these women knew it yet, but that night it became official. After this meeting of the minds with the young Tibetan man, they would both become his students and dedicate the rest of their lives to him, which was something that would happen to so many after they heard him speak. The young Tibetan man who was speaking that night was Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche, and it would take me most of my life to realize Tibetan Buddhism and Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche were 2 very different things, and that Buddhism altogether was completely different from Tibetan Buddhism. And to make it even more confusing, Shambhala isn't even Buddhism. Shambhala is many things, but it's not what the Buddha taught. Mix flour and water together, then seal it off from the rest of the world, and it will create its own culture. This is how Buddhism changed when it traveled from India to Tibet. It became isolated and created an entirely new culture, barely resembling its origins. I don't really know anything about Buddhism without the Tibet in it. And because I'm an American and have never been to Tibet, I barely know anything about Tibetan Buddhism. But what I do know about is Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche. Whether that is Buddhism or Tibetan Buddhism, I couldn't say. A lot had already happened to Trungpa Rinpoche before that night in the church, when my mother and Anne and many others met him for the first time. Trungpa Rinpoche was born in eastern Tibet in 1939, and shortly after his birth was recognized as a tulku, or reincarnate lama, which meant that when he was 5 years old, he was taken from his family and raised by monks and lamas in the Kagyu and Nyingma schools of Vajrayana Buddhism, specific to Tibet. Then in 1959, after years of studying the Dharma and at the bright age of 20, he led an escape party out of Tibet during the Chinese invasion. Crossing the Himalayas on foot, they entered India at the mouth of the Brahmaputra River under a shroud of Chinese bullets. What follows is a rare moment captured on tape of his recollection of that day.
I must reflect back to past memories. When I've just crossed the river Brahmaputra in Tibetan Indian border, and we have to lie down on the ground because the bullets bouncing all over the place by the communist mortar and the shells. You can hear this ping pong sound of bullets ricocheting all over the place. And my first thought is, I will never give up. And I will go and teach. And this fear of you might get hit by a bullet was encouragement to me.
It had been a scary and dramatic escape. Many people had died. Those that survived landed in refugee camps in India. Trungpa spent 4 years in the camps, and during that time, he fathered a child with a Tibetan nun who had been in his escape party, met Westerners for the first time, and landed a scholarship to study at Oxford. When he left India and arrived in England in 1963, he met all kinds of people, many of whom were interested in what he had to say and wanted to establish a teacher-student relationship with him. And then a series of emotional and physical events took place in England and Scotland that would forever transform him. After meeting Trungpa Rinpoche, 16-year-old Diana Pybus dropped out of boarding school to marry him in Scotland, to the fury of the British press on January 3, 1970. Then members of the existing community of Tibetans living in the United Kingdom grew decidedly concerned about his proclivity for alcohol, his relationships with women, and his highly unusual style of teaching, all of which seeded dissent. And whilst drunk, Trungpa drove his car into a joke shop, which landed him in the hospital with injuries so severe that he would never walk unaided again. As the trauma and drama of these events subside, he sets his eyes on America with the desire to bring meditation to the West, his true mission. In early March 1970, Trungpa and Diana fly to New York, but are denied entry and rerouted to Toronto. Without a dime, they make do in Canada for some months until their U.S. visas can come through. And by the end of May 1970, they formally enter the United States, where they eventually settle in Boulder, Colorado, a part of the country that is widely acknowledged to look and feel like Tibet to Tibetans. That night, at St. Mark's Church, Trungpa Rinpoche was just getting started. He hadn't even been in the country for 6 months yet. He was zigzagging from coast to coast, teaching and meeting people. After the event, when my mother realized there was no place in his world for her, because it wasn't yet a world, she forgot about him. A few months later, we would leave New York City and start 4 years of zigzagging of our own, living in and out of communes, cars, and other people's homes, too broke to get a place of our own. Then, in 1974, my mother heard about Trungpa again. We were going to join him and his students from all over the country, and soon the world, in the foothills of the Rockies to become the largest Tibetan Buddhist organization in the West, yet with a secret and an even more bizarre mission: to establish the kingdom of Shambhala, which, like Shangri-La, was a hidden paradise on earth. I want to conclude this episode by saying this is not a podcast about the life of Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche. This is about the role Shambhala played in my life, the pitfalls of devotion, and what happens when you fall in. Trungpa Rinpoche could be easily replaced by anyone else who calls themselves a guru, or a teacher, or a lama, or a spiritual guide. Our theme music is Vampire Tango, written and produced by Ryder Cooley and the Dust Bowl Fairies. Buy their music at dustbowlfairies.com. That's Dust Bowl, F-A-E-R-I-E-S.com, dustbowlfairies.com. Special thanks to Mike Schoonmaker. Produced and written by Una Morera. Sound effects are Creative Commons usage. The excerpt of Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche is from the Chronicle Project. Find out more at chronicleproject.com. Please share where podcasts are shared.
And the circus